Hey guys, so the funny thing about this episode, honestly, is that for as amazing and epic and great as it was, there and for as many things as there are to talk about the episode, when you really look at this episode objectively and objectively and just at its bare bones level, in the grand scheme of things, this particular episode, just in the way it was structured and paced, it largely felt somewhat like a pretty much prelude of what's to come next week. And that's not, and don't get me wrong, that's not meant as a slight against the episode or anything, but this whole episode felt like one of those episodes that's pretty much prepping us for what's to come, and just kind of eases into the idea, and just kind of like just sets things up properly in order for next episode to basically where shit is absolutely going to hit the fan. And just based on the preview, it looks like, again, that's exactly how things are gonna go. Next episode, I think, just based off the preview, it more or less says, it is more or less telling us that next episode is gonna hit us hard and fast in all the best ways possible. Like that pretty much goes without saying that the next episode is gonna be an absolute freaking banger. Like it's one of those things where when you just look at the preview, you almost want to say, "Damn, I wish we had a, I wish that episode got released today on top of this one." But yeah, um, with that said, though, the episode starts where it left off, with Odin pretty much being cared for by Toki after having failed Whitebeard's test. And even though Odin does end up joining the Whitebeard pirates in the end, I love how it's shown to us that Odin is such a free spirit that he really couldn't have given a shit pretty much as to what happened with Whitebeard, pretty much so long as he was free from the confines of Wano and allowed to explore beyond its walls. Like Odin, it's little moments like that show that Odin truly is someone who does not take freedom for granted. And as we see, just for that little montage of him as part of Whitebeard's crew, there was so much through his exploration on board Whitebeard's ship that had changed his view of the world, and how he had seen it, if he already had, and how his views had already changed just based on the idea that he wasn't confined to Wano, and that he was allowed to explore these, like, the vast oceans of the world. I also like how very early on in the episode we establish a connection between Odin and Toki, and it only grows stronger from there. Um, and the other thing I also like is that we get the introduction to someone who again would go on to how in a confrontation with the slavers before, we basically get the introduction to a character who would later become a member of Whitebeard's crew later on. That's kind of funny how things work like that. One of the most interesting things about this episode, though, is the introduction of Blackbeard and how he basically ended up joining Whitebeard's crew, which is cool to see in itself. But the interesting thing is how the perspective has shifted. Is how when you look at Blackbeard's introduction and him joining Whitebeard's crew, it gives us kind of a vastly different perspective on basically Shanks's conversation with Whitebeard all the way back in like episode 150s, in episode like 150 or something like that, where Shanks basically tells Whitebeard straight up that one of the main reasons as to why he joined, why Teach had joined, was so he could basically so he could bide his time, and how he just did little more, and how he did as little as he could in order to hide his true intentions behind Whitebeard's shadow. Like just looking at that conversation now, and the idea that the Blackbeard was able to more easily seize power because of that, it it just shows, it gives a different perspective on just how far, it gives you perspective and just kind of wonders like how far back was Teach's intent. And and one thing with this episode specifically that really caught my attention, honestly, that has to do with Blackbeard as well, is how in the same vein that pretty much Blackbeard had hidden himself underneath Whitebeard's shadow in order to eventually seize power. Um, at the same time, it is interesting how Orochi had a similar thing, had also gone down a similar path, and and how in a lot of ways Orochi's rise to power are in part because of their ability to blend in and present themselves as someone that others can very easily let their guard down around. And in a lot of and because of this, you could actually say that Whitebeard's and Owen's oversight of this is ultimately what had caused both the downfall of the Whitebeard pirates and the Kozuki clan. Like it is because of just not being able to see or understand the intent of these individuals that it caused the downfall of pretty much two great pretty much dynasties, the dynasty of Whitebeard and the dynasty of the Kozuki clan. So yeah, it is interesting how it is just interesting to see how both Blackbeard and Orochi, while pretty much obviously being pretty much two separate people from pretty much two separate parts of the world, also had this very had this very like had this had are basically two people who are basically cut from pretty much two sides of the exact same cloth, you could say. It's yeah, it is kind of scary looking at this again, and just seeing how Blackbeard and Orochi kind of parallel each other. Um, and but the saddest part as well is that between Blackbeard and Orochi, I think in some small way, they started off with good intentions, but like everything else in this world, the prospect of things like power can it can pretty much so very easily corrupt people, and they were no different. Um, and another thing that's really been interesting for me between this week and last week is seeing just how much contempt and hostility that pretty much Izo had towards Whitebeard before reaching that point of becoming one of his commanders, and how a lot of his early attitude towards Whitebeard, in a lot of ways, it does reflect the isolationist attitude towards the outside world, in contrast to Odin's ideals of wanting to expand his worldview. So, because of what we've seen from Izo in the past to what he was like in the present, with basically how he inevitably became a division commander of Whitebeard's crew, it shows this journey of traversing the seas. It was just as beneficial to him as it was for Odin, but by how the experience itself had sort of broadened his horizon, so to speak, and it gave him a different view of a more enlightened view of the world, so to speak. Of course, of course, as we see it, it also allowed him to kind of understand the urgency of certain situations, like when he pretty much when he still was a little concerned about what happened back, about what's going on with Wano. And yeah, Mizo's kind of got reasons for that. um and yeah, while we're talking about the commanders, though, one of the interesting thing we learned is that Odin was the first second division commander on Whitebeard's crew. Like it was only it's actually interesting to see that it was only around Odin's time where the division commanders had actually been formed. Like it wasn't until Odin had joined that the division commanders system had actually been formed on Whitebeard's crew, which is kind of interesting in itself. But even more than that, it's it it definitely feel the fact that Odin was the very first like second division commander it feels all the more beautifully poetic to know that from Ace, who had previously like ventured into Wano himself, would eventually go on to take up in order to take up Odin's position as the second Vision Commander. So it's like I love how shit just so beautifully connects like that in One Piece. It's kind of amazing. Um, Also, through the bond of, also, as I said previously, another interesting thing about another key thing with this episode is seeing the bond of Toki and Odin growing stronger, and we also learn a bit more about Toki herself, specifically that her parents were from Wano, but she doesn't know anything more beyond that. And that right there is already the first breadcrumb that Toki is not your average person. There is something more going on with her, and that is yet to be revealed. And yet we also see, yet despite these mysteries, we just see how quickly one thing that takes precedence is just how her relationship with Odin had slowly started to change, and how she had come to love Odin, which of course led to the birth of Momonosuke and Higori, which I do find it very crazy even to this day that that both Odin's children were born on Whitebeard shit, but it's not shocking either. But yeah, guys, that's all I got for this review. If you enjoyed the video, like, comment, subscribe, follow me on Twitter, Facebook, Analyst, or Crunchyroll. Dead Knight of Anime, signing off. Later, guys.